Thank you for that introduction. And thank you to the VLab organization for putting this panel together and for asking me to moderate. It is a real honor. I was contacted by Ravi some time ago on LinkedIn, and I was humbled and honored. But I shot right back and said, "Hey, what qualifies me to do this to come moderate this conversation?" And he gave a great answer, and it's certainly a great panel that we get to work with tonight. So regardless of the outcome, I've been told that I can put in my LinkedIn profile that I've lectured at Stanford after. So whether I'm qualified or not, you'll see my LinkedIn status update tomorrow. Is the clicker up here? Fred, we talked about this. So here's what we want to do. We want to make this compelling. There's an opportunity to make this engaging. A lot of that falls on my shoulders to keep things moving along, and I promise to do that. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping items. There's going to be a Q&A session at the last 30 minutes of this panel discussion will be Q&A. So questions coming from the audience and live stream, so you'll have a chance to interact and engage with the panel. Before that, here's the format. I'm going to do just a quick 6 or 7 slides to set the context and to sort of get a baseline understanding. I appreciate that there's both business and technical folks in here, so I want to establish a little bit of common ground there. So about 8 minutes. Our featured company, Amir and company, will have another 8 minutes to take you through just kind of an overview of what they do. And then the balance of the panel will have 2 minutes to give an introduction, 2 to 3 minutes or 30 seconds. And then we'll get right into the panel discussion. That's about a half hour, and then the balance of the time will be Q&A. If you have questions, you can text them to the number you see there, and feel free to tweet out anything relevant or compelling that you think of throughout the balance of the panel discussion. So that's the number for text questions, and I think we'll throw it up again at the end of these slides. So let's jump right into this and kind of start right here. The title of the panel tonight is Zero Trust, and I sort of came up with what, why, how, and when, and maybe a little tongue-in-cheek, how do you trend to the top of a Google search? Because if you Google Zero Trust today or tomorrow, your results are going to change and maybe change dramatically. And I think that's representative of where this idea of Zero Trust is right now. There's a lot of thoughts, there's a lot of ideas, there's maybe a little bit of theology, if you will, technical theology that's going to come out tonight in this panel discussion. And so what we aspire to get to is some of that common ground. What can we agree on with respect to Zero Trust, and is it as transformational as maybe the industry's hyping it to be? So I'm going to give you this slide. This is for both the business folks and the technical folks, and I'm not going to go deep in either, but I want to just set the context and the foundation. This is the world we know. And we're going to talk, in terms of security and cybersecurity, maybe this is an oversimplification, but this is really where we come from and where we are today. And so I want to introduce a couple of terms. This idea of perimeter, you're going to hear a lot about the perimeter. And the perimeter is that line, that demarcation point in my enterprise with respect to what I trust and what I don't trust in terms of how we deploy security today. Think of it, and I'll show you a graphic, as a castle and a moat and maybe hot oil. And if you're inside my castle, you're inside my perimeter and I trust you. And the moat is that sort of middle ground. We'll call that a DMZ, or a demilitarized zone. And then maybe that hot oil is a second level DMZ. And so I'll push some assets out there, and if they get compromised, that's okay. They're a little bit disposable, and I can replace them fairly cheaply. And the thing that's keeping bad people out is that firewall. And so you're going to see the firewall at some of those different demarc points between the perimeter and where that zone of trust is and where those untrusted resources are. We're going to talk a lot about this tonight in terms of what does this look like going forward. Some might suggest that the perimeter is dead and it's an outdated idea, and some may disagree with that and say, no, we still need the perimeter. And so we'll have that conversation, and I'll move that part of the conversation along. So what is Zero Trust? Turns out that's going to be my first question for the panel. to everybody to sort of zero in on zero trust. What do you think it is? A couple of ideas here, and I won't read through it, but a couple things come to mind. First is location of a resource, that is a person or an application or a device, is no longer an attribute of security. Today, and it used to be that if you're within my perimeter, I trust you. And it turns out that's how a lot of attacks are perpetrated and escalated, by giving that level of trust. And so what Zero Trust says is we trust no one and no device, no application, and no person. And so we're going to take advantage of technology to establish identity, to establish trust, maybe on an application or workload basis, and maybe evolve from this idea of the perimeter. So the last point here is just maybe a little provocative. Is this the end of perimeter thinking? And again, I'm going to try and get to the panel with this and really kind of kick these ideas around. I included a quote from Forrester with respect to the perimeter. So now that you have an understanding, we sort of have a baseline understanding very simplistically of what the perimeter is, I'll read it here. As businesses monetize information and insights across a complex business ecosystem, the idea of a corporate perimeter becomes quaint, even dangerous. And that's from Forrester in some of their forward thinking about industry leaders in the zero trust space. So again, another sort of provocative approach about maybe what zero trust is. Here's what we know about the reality of enterprise security today. At least three things. The attacks that enterprises are undergoing when they occur are massive, at massive scale. Whether it's a distributed denial of service attack, and I'm just pumping a lot of data at you so that your website doesn't work, or a bigger attack. They're big and they're getting bigger. Second, these attackers are increasingly persistent and they're patient. And if you recall the government OPM data attack, that was a particularly big and bad and damaging one that stands out. If you don't know about it, I'll give you a quick overview. OPM is the Office of Personnel Management in Washington, D.C., and they manage all information and security clearance for both government workers and contractors. And that's millions of people. Turns out I'm a contractor at Akamai with the government, and I hold a very high level of security clearance, and I hold multiple polygraphs. And this is how this process goes down. I sit with an examiner, and they dig way back into my history, and they find out a lot of things about me. And they take notes, and then they hand jam it into a database, and then it gets stuck into OPM, and then OPM gets breached, and the people who perpetrated that attack have all my information. So these attackers are persistent, and the consequences are serious. And then finally, the attack surfaces themselves are growing very big. Equifax is a great example of that. So the stakes are high. We have to be right all the time, and the bad guys are right just once. Three ideas. I just plant quick seeds here. When we talk about zero trust deployment options, and I'm going to ask this question, there's sort of three schools of thought. Network segmentation, which is different than software-defined perimeters, which is different still from application access proxies. So is there a right way? Is there a wrong way? Is there the first way? Is there a fourth way? We're going to talk about that tonight. Last slide. Here's the objectives and the outcomes of this conversation tonight. Three objectives. First is to provide insight through a really, really smart panel of industry leaders. The second is let's be a little disruptive, and let's create a little disruptive thinking. And then finally, let's talk about what's possible. What's the possibility here? If I had to talk about three outcomes, three real tangible things we could do, let's establish common ground. Let's take zero trust off the whiteboard and into action. And finally, let's figure out what to measure and how to make tangible improvements. And here's the final thought. The role of the moderator, my role tonight, is to ask compelling questions, to maintain an engaging tempo, and I think importantly, to create controversy when possible. Good, healthy controversy, but I'm a big believer when everyone's thinking the same, no one's thinking. And I think we have four gentlemen here that have different thoughts and different approaches, and it's going to make for a good conversation. So thank you for tonight, and appreciate your time. Make sure you ask questions. And with that, I'm going to ask Amir to come up and take the mic.
Thank you, Randy. So I have 8 minutes, so I'll try to get through the content pretty quickly. I'm Amir Sharif. I'm one of the co-founders of Aporeto, and we work on identity-powered cloud security, basically ensuring that every entity within the network knows who they're talking to, and it's through authentication and authorization that we establish trust. So why do we solve this problem? The answer is that there are two major movements that are happening. Randy alluded to some of them. One is that the private data center is migrating to the public cloud. So what we used to do inside our Santa Clara data center or Equinix is now going to AWS or Azure. And the second one is we're adopting new software architectures. So with those come two problems. One is, as Randy said, is the perimeter is disappearing. I don't think it's dead yet, but it might as well be, because if it's disappearing, it's porous, it's going to create problems, as some of our customers know. And second is, when I do go to an infrastructure or to a public cloud, I no longer own that infrastructure. I cannot define the perimeter physically as I used to before. So is it wise to try to do it in software? That's a question. Now, when it comes to software architectures, we're all after business agility. We're trying to get out differentiation in terms of code instructions that make our businesses different. So to do that, we like to copy and paste a lot. And that copy and pasting is done in terms of libraries, open source code, and so forth. We're just putting in a lot of stuff in our code, and we don't really know what it is. And second, we're absorbing this new architecture as microservices that basically allow us to very quickly update portions of our application. For example, AWS, which is the world's largest cloud, they release, or in 2011, they were releasing a change in production every 11.6 seconds. That's an insanely fast pace for something that large. But to do that, you have to have a different software architecture, and that increases your attack surface. So if you look at the picture and frame it in this light, we're on a journey to go from servers to serverless. Servers is the stuff that we had in our data center, and serverless is basically what we want to have in a public cloud where our developers write code and check it in. Now, there's a couple of things happening. One is, as we're migrating, or we've done basically the migration from servers to VMs, but as we did this, the number of endpoints on a network increased by a factor of order of magnitude, factor of 10. We are in the process of adopting containers, and eventually serverless will come. So as the network surface is increasing, we're also increasing the rate of change. And when we resolve the network, we're doing it in a quadratic space. That's a little bit of math, but it's a quadratic equation that we're solving in order to make sure that things are talking well to themselves. We used firewalls, access control lists, network constructs that are IP address dependent in order to create those segmentations. And my premise is that it's no longer wise to do that as we go up the food chain. And what's happening inside the industry is that the security teams are trying to use old technology. The firewall was invented in 1994, a year after the Penniman check was developed. They're trying to use old technology in order to secure where we are today, which is based on the cloud infrastructure, microservices, things that are very fast and moving. And it's that tension between the enterprise wanting to move fast and the security teams that are holding slow that creates opportunities for startups like me. So why is an IP address is bad? Why is and here is, my brethren here are network centric, so I'm going to poke a little bit fun at them. But why is the poor man's identity, which is an IP address, a bad thing? One is when we're going to the cloud, it's a fungible resource. And because it's fungible, IP addresses change all the time. And IP addresses are like street addresses. It's a location. It's not an identity. And it so happens that both my dog and I live in the same address. And if you take my address as my identity, you may get my dog, and he's nicer than I am, but that's not be necessarily the person that you want. A more colorful example would be that if I were to use an excuse with my wife, is that I assumed that the woman in the bedroom was my wife. I don't think that would fly really well. You have to go beyond identity, beyond location to know what identity is. And firewalls are so old that the ancient Egyptians were kind of worshiping them back then. This is we really need to get beyond this concept. So it's this problem that we're trying to solve at Aporeto, and we founded the company about 3 years ago. I'm proud of the list of investors that we have: Wing, Comcast Ventures, Norwest Venture Capital, InQtel, the government. So Randy, the guys that are backing, that you're selling to, are backing us up. So I'm really happy with the list of customers. And Informatica, I have to give a special shout out to them because they were our first customer, and they're sitting here in the audience. So thank you so much for that. And what we do is we segment applications and networks purely based on application identity, not based on IP address. So we have a character called Handsome Hank. He doesn't like IP addresses. That should drive the point home that location information is not a good proxy for identity. Application identity is. And this is not a new concept. We use identity all the time. Every time we log in, let's say to Gmail, we go to get a token that identifies who we are. What Aporeto does is effectively the same thing for applications. So think of us as Okta for applications, where we automatically create application identity, and based on that identity, we authenticate and authorize what the application components do. And this is how we create a zero trust model, which hopefully we'll define in our panel. So the net effect for the customers that we have is something that's as complex as what you see on the screen, which is SDN overlays, segmentation with access control lists, with east-west firewalls, VPN tunnels, all of that. That goes away with Aporeto. It becomes a much simpler networking model. Everything can be flat. We don't really care where application components are. It's based on identity, not location, that we care about. And we have the capability of encrypting traffic completely transparently to the application. So it's this simplicity that we create. And our value premise is stronger security, simpler operations, and better ROI. So with that, I'm going to hand the baton back to, I guess, the next person.
Yeah, so thank you, Amir. Here's what I'd like to do. For the balance of the panel, we'll start with Andrew. If we can just do a quick introduction, kind of who you are, what you do, where you come from, and whatever shameless commercial you want to provide.
No commercial. The slide went away, but I want to start off by saying the problem with cybersecurity is that every picture you ever see about it is somebody in a hoodie facing a bank of monitors in a dark room. So if you want to know why it's considered such a morbid topic, that picture that you saw up there, that's the one that usually gets it going. My name is Andrew Rubin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a software company called Illumio that obviously is in the cybersecurity space. I'll give you 30 seconds or less on the company, and then I'll tell you what we actually do. I started the company with our CTO and co-founder a little over 6 years ago. We spent about 2 years building the software privately. We call it stealth mode out here. And we've been in market selling the software for the past 4 or so years. We're about 350 people globally. We've raised a little over $330 million. Our largest investor is JP Chase. And then there's a string of individuals and VCs that have been kind enough to join the team along the way. What Illumio does is actually very simple, or at least the simple explanation of it certainly explains why customers care about it. We built a software platform that helps our customers, predominantly large enterprises, people like JP Morgan or Salesforce, to be able to find things inside of their data center or cloud environment that don't belong there, and then stop them from spreading or moving around. And one of the ways that I've described the software since the very beginning, since we literally pitched Andreessen Horowitz for the money to start the company, is our software platform does 2 things. The first thing it does is it's literally like an MRI machine in a hospital. You walk in and you say, I feel sick. The doctor doesn't just slice you down the middle and start rummaging around inside to find out what's wrong. They collect data. They take pictures. They try and figure out what's in there that shouldn't be or what's acting in a strange way. So our first job when we arrive at a customer is not to stop anything or block anything or necessarily do anything other than to build a map that explains to you everything running inside of your data center and cloud, tell you what each one of those things is, and most importantly, how they're all connected and talking to each other. Inevitably, when you see that map for the first time, you have a moment. We call it the fill in the blank moment, when you realize there's all sorts of things connected in ways you could never have imagined, and therefore talking to each other in ways that they shouldn't be. And the second thing the software does is it allows you to write policy. People call it segmentation nowadays, but it's policy that simply says things should talk to each other or not talk to each other a certain way. And the simplest example is there isn't a company left on planet Earth that doesn't have a development environment. Think of it as sort of the cesspool where they build and test and play with things, and a production environment, which is where they run the things that matter. Those two things usually shouldn't talk to each other. Very often they do. We build the map that allows you to see it and understand it, and then we allow you to write policy that says these things over here shouldn't talk to these. And of course, the kicker in this is every single breach you've ever heard about, every one, OPM, Equifax, go down the list, Target, Home Depot. The one common thread in all of them is something got attacked, something got breached. It wasn't the Holy Grail, it wasn't the golden nugget, but because that one thing was accessed, they were able to move all throughout the inside, usually for a long time without ever being detected, and eventually get to the vault and steal the gold. And so segmentation is a way to prevent that from being so easy or hopefully ever happening. That's us.
Right on. Andrew, thanks.
So I'm Pere Monclus. I'm the CTO in the Network and Security Business Unit at VMware. And the story of VMware is an interesting one in the sense that it was the company that created the notion of virtualization for the enterprises, leveraging some of the concepts that came before from IBMs and mainframes and so on. And it established a name in the industry on how to create these compartments, virtual machines that essentially would emulate what a server can do in a kind of a way that would be easier to operate and isolate from the other ones. The company has been transformed in the last 4 or 5 years, essentially with the entrance into this, what we call network and security. But it was more about this notion of saying, you cannot think in terms of compute, storage, networking, and then add security on top, and think security in terms of network security, because as we were describing before, this is a much more complex problem. It's a matter of understanding identity, understanding relations, understanding life cycle of things. So as VMware kind of went from being a virtualization company to what we call a software-defined infrastructure company, or even like a multi-cloud company, the problems became bigger and bigger in the sense that once you have a set of assets that have been put in data centers for companies for over 20 years, when a new revolution comes in terms of how to reinvent security, how to reinvent computing, how to go to containers, how to go to serverless, we look always at the problem of what's the unique security model that is needed in terms of how to define identity, how to define who make changes to certain applications life cycles, how to discover relations between things. But at the same time, there is this notion of how do you carry the existing environments into this new future, and how do you bridge between what you have and what you're going to have, and essentially be the transition into these new two worlds. So we are going to discuss it over the panel, but essentially we help our customers to go towards this future that we say about any device, any app, any cloud, and help them along the way to do all the transitions in terms of infrastructure, in terms of security, in terms of automation, that will allow the future enterprises to essentially become more agile, multi-cloud, and essentially more secure, because otherwise there's no such thing as providing infrastructure without security, and there's no such thing as providing networking without security anymore, especially in this multi-cloud environment. So that's where kind of what VMware is doing, and I'll cover a little bit more details as we speak.
Deepak.
Thank you, Randy, David, and team for inviting us. It's ZeroTrust. I'm wondering who to trust here. But, definitely a trust Pere for sure. Not sure about Andrew.
We have history.
Yeah, we have a history. I learned ZeroTrust concept from Andrew like 6 years ago first. So Dell Technologies Capital is the venture capital investment arm for Dell Technologies, which is the holding company of Dell, VMware, RSA, SecureWorks, Pivotal, and a bunch of others. So we are financial investors and enterprise IT. So we try to invest in the best possible companies in all different categories of enterprise IT, from cybersecurity, DevOps, storage, semiconductors, and so on. Cybersecurity is about 25% of our investment portfolio. We have been in business as a team for about 7 to 8 years. Two of my partners who were there from the beginning are here in the audience, Raman and Scott. So I joined 2 years ago from another venture firm, General Catalyst Partners. We try to combine the best of financial investors and corporate leverage. So as being an extended part of the Dell family, we have access to a lot of CIOs, CISOs, DevOps heads, VP of infrastructure, and so on. And a lot of our investments are informed by what CIOs and CISOs see. We probably spend more time with customers than we spend with startups to inform our investment decision making. Talking a little bit about cyber, I'll share a little bit about our portfolio. We were the first investors in Zscaler. We were one of the early investors in Netscope, Cylance, Redlock, Zingbox, Jask, Adalom, and a bunch of others. So we believe that Zero Trust should be a part and parcel of every cyber product and every infrastructure product, every application layer product, and also part and parcel of us too. Zero Trust is also a human problem as much as it is a technology and a product problem. And I'll give you like a very, very basic first principles example. When we are teaching our kids, do we ask them to trust everybody by default as infants or toddlers, or do we say, don't go to strangers? That's a fundamental thing that humans are doing when they teach their kids. But IT security is not in that way today. So I think we need to bring some of those concepts that we have learned as humans about trusting others into IT security as well. And then maybe we don't need that man in the hoodie there if we do that.
All right. Deepak, thanks. So here we are. We're right on time. By the way, that was flawless, gentlemen. Thank you very much. I mean, we're exactly where we need to be. So we're going to get rolling. We're going to roll fast, and we're going to start hitting hard. So easy question, a little bit of softball. If you guys could just be sort of quick here. 2 parts. First is, in your own words, a sentence or 2. Andrew, maybe 3. What is the meaning of Zero Trust? 4, Frank. What's the meaning of Zero Trust? And back to this perimeter idea, is the perimeter firewall still relevant? So, Amir, we'll just go down the line.
Okay, have the privilege of being first. So the Russians have an expression, trust and verify. I think the better expression, especially if you're dealing with a Russian, is that never trust and always verify. That's what Zero Trust means. It's, just because something is within what you perceive as your domain of control, your data center, it doesn't mean that it's okay. And you have to look for signatures that verify that this component does what it's supposed to do and connects to what it's supposed to do and gets access to the data. So that's the notion of Zero Trust. Sorry, the second question.
Perimeter firewall, is it relevant? What? You have a jacket that says otherwise, right?
So I do have a jacket. That's you're throwing the firewall away. Now, to be realistic, I think there is a role for a firewall still in the enterprise, but I have to be provocative as a startup guy. I would say throw it away. No, but really there is a use for firewalls, especially north-south firewalls. But I think that role is getting more and more diminished. You wouldn't see it, though, if you look at Palo Alto's stock price. Palo Alto Network.
It's interesting. I have more than a few friends at Palo Alto back home in Washington, D.C., and I poke them in the chest with that whole, and they get a little scared. But you're right. There's still firewalls are being consumed at a massive clip. So okay, Andrew.
So I think Zero Trust is a strategy. I think it's a framework. I think it's evolving and becoming an architecture, but what it's not is it's not a product or a vendor. It's not one thing. It's not one solution. It's a set of security controls that when blended together and used in conjunction end up providing you with a framework or an architecture where you can say, I'm now achieving something called Zero Trust. And to be clear, I think it's very, very early and nobody knows what that end result is going to look like. And vendor names and logos will go in and out of filling those different control points over time. The firewall comment to me is really funny because there's a very well-known analyst firm that actually went out on a very, very long limb a long time ago and said the firewall is dead, except not just Palo Alto's stock price, but quite frankly, more importantly, their revenue number keeps going up every year, and it's not just them. Fortinet and Checkpoint seem to pull off the same stunt as well. I mean, the reality is this. Security has never been a single layer. It's probably never going to be a single layer because there's no one layer that should be trusted that much. And the same way that nobody goes home and says, I have motion detectors and an alarm in my house, therefore I'll take the lock off the front door because, well, the alarm is going to save me. People like to have different security controls in order to feel like when you layer them all together, when one fails, the other one's going to save me. And the lock on the front door is still on the front door of every building and house that I've ever walked through. I think what's changing is that there are new places to put things, new buildings, in this case it's new clouds. There are new places to put things where the firewall is not as relevant or the architecture no longer is as relevant. But to simply say that a perimeter is gone or dying or dead is sort of stretching it to the extreme. And the reality is usually somewhere closer to the middle.
By the way, I wish my young daughters would acknowledge there's a lock on the front door.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And there's a light switch too.
Yeah.
Good. Pere.
Maybe I'll start with the firewall question first, and then I'll go to the Zero Trust. So imagine that you live in Manhattan, and you say, I'm going to secure Manhattan once forever, and I'm going to put the army in every single bridge, and I'm going to stop any single bad guy crossing the bridge. Would the crime disappear from Manhattan, yes or no? And what happens is that, going back to Andrew's comment, is security is a complicated topic because it's about layers, it's about understanding different levels of inspection, different levels of behavior, different levels of things. But the notion that blocking the entry and exit of a complex system would completely secure you is, I mean, we've been in this industry for 40, 50 years, and we are still not secure, right? So somehow we've proven the point that firewalls are not going to solve the problem by themselves. Now, you go to a city, and what do you have? You have the firemen, you have the police, you have the armored cars to move money, and then you have limos for the executives, and you have taxis for people who want to move. So essentially, we adjusted to a set of tools and capabilities for every single use case, depending on the risk that you are willing to tolerate on the asset that you are moving in the city. So now, why until now we were being able to survive with firewalls? Because applications were fairly static, because the ports that we were exposing outside were fairly limited, because enterprises would not expose all their assets, all their applications, and all their customers being outside in the internet. We were like serving a community that was fairly well contained, and you had internal attacks, but then there was a question about trust. So firewalls serve a purpose when enterprises were not as open as exposed, and you didn't have as many applications and as dynamic as applications as we have right now. So now you live in a new world where I have container-based applications with containers coming and going. IP address don't mean anything. I have my legacy VMs that now have to be connected to containers that are running in the internet, and exploits are coming in. So now is, what do I do? So to me, Zero Trust, now going back to the second question, is this notion of saying, what answer do we provide to the new environment where we live, where developers are developing new applications faster and faster. They are taking the matter on their own hands, putting it into public clouds. Identity models and policy models in public clouds may be different from the ones you've had in the enterprise. Management teams in terms of operations and security tend to be in different sides of the spectrum. People that understand cloud may not understand infrastructure and vice versa. So now going back to how do we redefine Zero Trust is this ability to say what kind of new tools, new capabilities, new perimeters, new edge environments do we build that we can understand not only who do we have in our networks, but what do those assets do in our networks, and we understand the problem end to end. So it's a set of looking at the new environment, looking at what's coming, and what tools and capabilities do we need in order to have some confidence in our infrastructure, because it's becoming more and more critical in the place where we live.
Thanks. So Deepak, as an investor, I suppose you have maybe a different view of the world with respect to Zero Trust, the perimeter, kind of what you guys look at, what you think about. How does that contrast?
Well, as long as a startup can sell a Zero Trust product, we'd like to invest in it. No, that is the truth of the matter, right? So, but let me give you like a more deeper answer. So when startups come and pitch to us, it's our job to evaluate a few different things. Are they pitching a concept? Are they pitching a technology? Are they pitching a product? Are they pitching a business? And sometimes you have a combination of all. And Zero Trust is definitely a framework or an application, or it's a concept. It's not a technology. It's not a product. It's not a business for sure. So we have seen Zero Trust in the context of micro-segmentation for sure, as somebody would agree here. We have seen and zero trust. VMware has been like a pioneer in applying zero trust principles, like how does a good workload behave in the context of app defense. And the challenge though is Google's paper, while the Beyond Cloud paper very far-reaching, in my opinion, it's pretty narrow in its interpretation of zero trust. There's a lot of focus on devices and users, but the primary atomic entities in an IT infrastructure are not just users and devices. There are workloads which change, and the half-life of workloads has consistently decreased. And also, the workloads are not any longer in your own premise. If you are outsourcing to a company in China, India, Brazil, your workloads are sitting there. How do you even trust those? So we have seen, now coming to network perimeter, the network perimeter has both collapsed and also expanded at the same time. So the network perimeter has collapsed into smaller workloads. So it's more of an application of workload perimeter now. And it's expanded beyond the borders of an organization. So how do you safeguard things beyond the borders? So we have taken bets in all of these. Collapsing a network, collapsing the network perimeter into a workload perimeter or a container perimeter or whatever, right? So we are investors in a company called Twistlock, which provides container security. In terms of expanding the borders of an organization, we are investors in a company called RiskRecon that provides security for things outside your organization. And they're all applying zero trust concepts to solving a business problem. And that's what we look like. That's what we look for. We look for startups which are trying to identify a business problem that is a top 5 CISO issue and not like a number 25 on a CISO's list of problems to solve. And I would say there are still some huge areas in enterprise security where zero trust concepts have not been applied yet. Email security, every email comes in by default, right? And I think in many aspects of web security too, zero trust has not been applied. You can browse any website by default. You are blocked from accessing a few websites, but you can browse in most websites by default.
Okay, so show of hands. RSA was 3 weeks ago. How many folks attended RSA? So just about the whole place, and the whole panel. I was at RSA. The first thought I have when I go to RSA is it's useful, but it's almost carnival-like. It's this carnival atmosphere. And I don't know, everybody's telling a different story.
VC-funded carnival.
What's that?
Venture capital-funded carnival.
It's a VC-funded carnival. And I think there are 1,200 vendors at RSA. So I want sort of like a one-thought, one-word answer from each of you here with respect to kind of what we saw at RSA and then Zero Trust. How does an organization, how does a company assess Zero Trust vendors and compare them? There were 1,200 folks telling a similar version of the story in a different accent. What's the one thing, I'm throwing it out there, if you had to go tell your customer, here's the one thing you got to look at?
I'll give you an anecdote just from a customer. 2 years ago, I was walking on the floor of RSA. There were about 1,200 vendors 2 years ago, too. It's not like it was 200 and now it's 1,200. And I'm walking with the CISO of one of the 10 largest banks in the United States. And the CISO, who I know very well, turns to me and says, so in a really good year, an aggressive year, I can maybe take 3 strategic bets that fundamentally change the risk posture of my bank. There are 1,200 vendors on this floor. I'm reasonably certain they're all not going to grow up. The point was, I get to take 2 or 3 bets a year. By the way, all of those banks probably take, with almost 100% overlap, the same 2 or 3 bets a year. 1,200 vendors aren't going to each be deployed at global scale inside of every one of those banks. It's too many vendors trying to chase very real, but very small problems. And part of the exercise of us starting these companies and trying to build them is to grow up. It's too many.
Yeah, so I want to be the one that the customers remember. If I'm a vendor there, right? I'm Akamai, and I want you to remember Akamai, and I want to tell a story that's different, and I want my story to become yours, and then I'm compelling, and maybe I'm memorable. So, with respect to Zero Trust, what are your thoughts?
Well, again, for us, Zero Trust is about never trusting and always verifying. And how do you operationalize that? in a way that makes sense for the customer, where they don't have to rewrite applications, they don't have to redeploy a lot of old tools. So going back to your original question, if I'm a vendor, I want to look for the solution that fits my operational model, that gives me better security than I have today, and ultimately doesn't break anything. Those are the three criteria I have.
Security is there that doesn't get in the way, that's transparent, but does what it says it's supposed to do.
Operationally fits,
Yep.
doesn't break things, and improves security. That's if I were a CISO, that's what I would choose.
So maybe my take is that why there are 1,200 companies or 2,500 companies, right? And I think in the 50s there was Noam Chomsky that was studying grammar and syntax and everything, and was defining the dimensions of communications. And essentially you had a sender, a receiver, a message carried over a channel with some sort of code, and then a context of the communication, right? And it's not the same to say, how are you today, of how are you today? So that the context of how I explain a message can change the meaning of the communication, right? So what happens is, what we see is that everybody looks at security problems from one of the dimensions of communication. And all of them are valid solutions that bring some meaningful value. But now what we have to always remember is that when we go to enterprises, when we go to our customers and we say, buy my product because it's best than anybody else, right? And the next guy is saying the same and the next guy is the same. So there are some cases where products look alike, they play in the same space, but a lot of times it's like coming from different dimensions. So the way we looked at RSA, and Pat Gelsinger, the CEO of VMware, was there talking about this problem of why so many and can the industry consume so many, and what do we do about that, right? So the way we are looking at it is more about how not only to focus about the basic dimensions of communications, like a sender, a receiver, a message, which this is kind of the obvious one, and the transport, but almost like to start thinking about the context. It's like, how can I understand not how are you behaving, but why are you changing behavior? Did you have a change of control, a change of management event? Or is the binary that is being deployed got a check-in from a developer? And what was the reputation of the developer? And I was talking to a large bank in New York, and they were using lots of open source, and they were even going to the point of creating a risk score on open source developers contributing to specific projects to understand if that code was worth it to put in production. So as we go into this new world that we will not even know where components are coming from, like putting gate over gate over gate over gate, as even pushing gates even more towards the perimeter, is going to eventually hit certain limits. So now is back to the context thing is, how do we understand what was the intent of what some application or some user or some complex system was supposed to do? And what do we do in terms of deviations to that? And can we track it to events that justify that behavior? So that's why at VMware maybe, and being a larger company, we are forced kind of to look at multiple dimensions because we have kind of a software infrastructure with multiple levels of the stack. But we are trying to look at the security on this. It's like, what's the context that I can aggregate about multiple sources in order to take better decisions or better risk management? Because security is not about black and white. It's always about a score and a prioritization of what events to take a look.
So Deepak, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question because I think you have obviously a different perspective, and maybe a little bit harder hitting. So statistically, back to this RSA thing, we're spending, and I think I'm asking a customer a question that everybody in this room wants to ask. If there's one question, you guys let me know if it showed up on the iPad. Here's the burning question on everybody's mind, and it's yours to answer. We're spending 5 times as much on security as we were 5 years ago. And VCs like yourselves are investing 4 times as much. And most of us would agree, if we're not less secure, we're not any more secure, right? So it's not, maybe it doesn't feel like it's paying off. It feels like we're spending a lot of money. It feels like there's a lot of investment there. So why is that? What, from your view as an investor, and kind of what you look for as you try and find the next big thing in the context of Zero Trust?
I'm not going to debate on the specifics of those. I think directionally you're right. Like, we are not any more secure than we were 4 or 5 years ago. But the world today is also very different from 4 or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, right? There was no public cloud 10 years ago. In public cloud, by default, everything is public. As an example, right? There was no globalization or outsourcing. So the number of attack vectors, the number of places where you can attack an organization has increased dramatically. We have a huge mobile workforce, and they're not sitting in a corporate premises, and many of them don't even have VPN access. You could argue that Google is trying to get out of VPN to be on corp and so on. So I actually think the demand for security is still far outstripping good products that can solve these problems. And that's definitely the bet that we are making by investing in cybersecurity startups. And our goal is to figure out which are those products which have a pervasive demand, which are solving pervasive problems and not niche problems. And that's what our problem is in life. It's not easy. I'm not claiming we have solved that. But I think that we should probably, as an industry, be investing far more in cybersecurity innovation.
May I take a different
Yeah, for sure.
So remember the chart I put up where I showed this is where we're going?
Yep.
So this is precisely the problem. We're using yesterday's technology to address the problems that we're facing today. That's why we have to dump so much money. It's ineffective spending. We can get a lot better at it. So if you try to feed hay to our cars don't go very far. We have to have the right tools in order to address it and to get the efficiency that we want. So it's a mismatch, an impedance mismatch of the capabilities of existing security technologies and the needs of the business from a security perspective that's creating that difference. Sorry.
I'll add the controversial comment, which is there were 1,200 vendors on the floor of RSA. Let's say there were 1,000 that were quote-unquote startups. Most of them aren't going to be around in 10 years.
Agreed.
I mean, I'll just say it. I know that it's a taboo thing to say sitting in the middle of Palo Alto, but the reality is that it has nothing to do with how smart the people are or how interesting the technology is. It's that you can't build a billion-dollar company solving a niche problem. And to the question around what separates out the companies that the CISO walking the floor of RSA remembers, it's the one that solves the biggest, most pressing problem in a way that fits into the enterprise's operating model. Like if they walk by 1,000 booths and they see 1,000 interesting things, at some point they all blend together, even if they're interesting. But if one of them is a problem that they get on a plane, fly back to New York, and the regulator shows up the next day and says, if you don't do this, I'm going to shut you down, the one that they attach in their mind to that can solve that problem, that's the one they're going to remember.
A consistent big bet problem that bubbles to the top with respect to the answer you just gave?
We're all probably highly biased in our
Let me
answer
hear
to
that. I want to hear, what do you think?
I don't look at it through technology, I look at it through the problem, and in our minds, the problem that the customer is trying to solve in security is always driven by one of three things. It's either regulatory and compliance, nothing to get a customer to act faster and spend money quicker than when a regulator shows up and says, I'm going to shut you down if you don't do this. HIPAA, PCI, SARB, any of the frameworks that you hear about. Second one is a breach. Tends to be reactive. It's usually not the most intelligent spend, but they do a lot the day after they're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Or the third one is in the event that there is a realization that from a risk perspective, there is real risk that they cannot tolerate anymore on their quote-unquote balance sheet. The board shows up and says, this Equifax thing, what are we doing to make sure that if this happens to us, it's not that bad, and I want a real plan. And so to the extent that you can bubble those things up, that's how you start to get them to look at it. It's not a technology conversation, it's actually a business conversation.
It has to be a business conversation. These are not insignificant investments that are being made that we're asking customers to make, and so it has to tie back to solving real business problems, right? So at some point it becomes a business conversation. Amir, what do you think?
I think Andrew is absolutely right, and as right as he is, it's a really depressing answer. So, because everything you talked about is regulatory requirements or a breach or the fact there's a risk, we're doing it out of fear, not because we're trying to do the right things for our customers.
So you're saying security is just simply a reactive, responsive thing. Is that the world we're in right now?
Isn't that why we go to the gym, is we're being reactive? We're trying to lose the weight we gained over Christmas? I mean, that's the way we approach it.
But maybe so. So it's we're reacting. Is that what you're seeing, Deepak? Are we reacting? Are companies that you're funding?
I think the companies with fastest growth know how to exploit the reactionary piece well. Now, the reactionary piece comes from all the drivers that Andrew and Amir alluded to. I'm going to take a slightly different framework of that, right? So, threat/regulatory driven, where a big incident has happened. I have unlimited budget, and I need to go figure out what caused that issue, and I need to go solve it. The problem is this, that most enterprises have come to a realization that it's not a question of if you're going to get hacked. The answer is yes. It's not a question of when. The answer is always. It's not a question of how bad it is going to be when it is bad. It's going to be very bad. It's really a question of how fast can you respond to bad situations, and how, if there's an epidemic in healthcare, it's only a question of how fast you can respond to it, and how good is your response strategy. So in the context of cybersecurity, it's instant response. That is one bucket, and there's a regulatory compliance piece to it, and like I don't want to get, I want a $100 million fine, not a $1 billion fine, right? So that's a trade-off I'm trying to make in some situations. There's the other IT trend piece outside the control of a CISO organization: adoption of virtual machines, adoption of containers, adoption of serverless, adoption of SaaS applications. Like adoption of SaaS applications led to the establishment of the CASB industry as a new category, a new budget line item. Right? And adoption of IaaS has led to the establishment of, like Gartner puts it in 3 different categories, like CWPP and a bunch of other things. Similarly, adoption of containers has led to a few things. So these are new attack surfaces that a CISO has to secure, but it's, again, reactionary. They had no control in the adoption of these technologies. So reactionary in terms of incidents or regulation or compliance, or reaction in terms of new IT trends?
All right, so let me sort of branch from there. I mean, some maybe we'd all agree that in the context of business relevance, the application is king, right? In some ways, it's all about the application. I think all roads somehow lead back. And traditionally, we've done a really bad job securing the application. And the movement to the cloud is real. I think we can agree on that. So in the context of Zero Trust, what are the opportunities to get it right the first time? Secure DevOps, for example, from a Zero Trust perspective, because we've not done that before. Security was always an afterthought, and here we are in 2019, and we're reacting, and we're spending a lot of money to react. So is the sweet spot for Zero Trust secure DevOps in this move to the cloud, Pere?
Maybe going back to the previous question, I was in the past working in a large networking company on security products, and there was always this discussion about designing secure networks versus implementing network security. And designing secure networks is, if you had the opportunity to think it through ahead of time and do it properly, you would create a system, but nobody does that. You create the network, and then you have to patch it with boxes, and that's network security, right? So if you take it to what Deepak was saying, security is reactive because you cannot stop innovation. I mean, Kubernetes is going to happen, serverless is going to happen, applications are going to be king, application is evolving into new frameworks, Kubernetes isolation model is not there yet, there's issues in there. So, but it's very powerful, and it brings significant value in terms of agility and business innovation. So now, when you start thinking in terms of how to roll security, security is always going to be to support the business, not a fundamental pillar of the business. So if the business is supposed to be more agile, if I have to compete with a company, a Web 2.0 or 3.0 company that is disrupting my business, first and foremost, I have to succeed as a business, I have to be agile. And then I have to secure it. So that's why I don't believe it's possible to think security ahead of time, because the people that are going to be in the forefront of innovation, driving new business creations, are going to go without waiting for security. And then there's going to be a team, secure ops, whatever, that will going to patch it behind.
Does someone want to challenge that?
Yeah, so maybe just a second, how to fix that, right? How to bring these two things together. So right now what we are doing is we are changing the way the development methodology in the enterprise is happening. So if you think in terms of what does CI/CD means, continuous integration, continuous delivery, is if I can tie the life cycle of the application creation process to the implementation of connectivity, network virtualization, whatever you want to call it, and realizing that network and security are not two different things. Because imagine that I go to a customer and say, yeah, I'm going to sell you the best network solution in the industry that is going to connect Google Cloud with an on-prem environment, but by the way, it's not secure. So it's not going to work. So if we get to the realization that network and security are one and the same, and that we have to tie to the life cycle of the creation process of applications, then is when we start having a way to maybe attempt to solve the problem. But if we have security as an afterthought, we will never be able to solve it.
Okay. And
I'm not sure I'm certainly not going to challenge it, but
No, challenge it. Come on.
I'll add a layer on top. A little bit of controversy, not a lot. So we sit with customers at Illumio, and they tend to be large enterprises, big banks, Citi, JPMC, big companies, Salesforce, Workday. And one of the things that, in all honesty, I think we got as wrong as we possibly could have when we started the company was the assumption that everything in the world is going to be clean and shiny and new. And especially when you sit in Silicon Valley, it is incredibly easy to delude yourself into believing that everything is going to be clean, shiny, and new. So if you're building security for what's called the green field, the new things, you have an unbelievable advantage because it's declarative from the beginning. You are literally figuring out what you're going to build. You can bind the security to the process from the very beginning. You're declaring what it is and how it should behave and how it should be secured. And then we got on a plane and we flew a couple of thousand miles east of here, and we started going to New York, and then a few thousand miles east of there and went to London. And these companies walked in and they said, yeah, so here's our reality. We have 100,000 servers in the world. About 99,990 of them have been in existence for some version of the last 20 years. They run 6,000 applications, most of which were built by people that literally left this organization 10 years ago. And there's a Post-it note under a keyboard somewhere that tells us how it works. And we're really scared that that environment is going to get breached because that's actually where we run everything and store all the data. And yes, we're on this path where over a long horizon, we're going to take this brownfield mess and turn it into this shiny greenfield thing. But like, we got to live with this thing, and we're running the whole plant on this thing for the next 10 years while that happens. And fixing that world is inherently reactive, but it's also by far and away the most complicated thing to fix. And so there's this struggle that's going on because there are these organizations that are much more forward-leaning, and they are doing all the right things to make sure that they don't recreate the problem of the past. But the problem is 99% of the world runs on the problems of the past. And we can't ignore it and say, well, we'll just worry about that later, or we won't worry about it at all because everything's going to be over here eventually. The eventually is years.
You know, if you ask the simple question, how many applications do you have in production today, I'm not sure anybody could tell you.
So we sat at RSA a year ago with a very large bank, and for the first time in the history of our engagement with them, which has been basically the 4 years we've been in market, they brought the cloud team in, and they have an AWS public deployment, and we said to the cloud team, out of the 6,000 or so apps that run in this bank, give or take, how many are actually really running in AWS today? And the number was this. Literally, and that's how they actually told us the answer. And they're not embarrassed by it. That is the pace that they're on. And it's not that it'll be 3 a year for the next 2,000 years. It will accelerate dramatically, but there's still the 5,997 of them back home that they have to secure and make sure that if they're breached, don't end up putting them on the front page of the journal.
Then it's safe to say, Amir, I want your thoughts on this. It's safe to say that the thing that's controlling, limiting, throttling the movement of applications to the cloud is the confidence in the secure experience. I, as an organization, I'm just not confident I can secure this application as I move it to the cloud, so I'm either not going to or I'm going to slow the pace of movement. Is that the essence of the problem? Is that one big problem?
I would like to expand it a bit. I mean, when we say application is king, I think data is king.
Okay.
And application access data. It's just that application today doesn't have the transitive property of carrying on whose behalf you are touching data. So we have created a network industry about applications, but at the same time there is a data component that when Equifax stock crashed, it was not because an application was compromised, it was because data was breached. So that's why we have to start thinking that it's not about just applications and connectivity, but it's the data aspect associated to the applications that we are touching.
Amir?
So to answer your question, there are a number of things that are slowing the migration to the cloud. Security concerns are certainly one of them, but in my opinion, the biggest one is lack of skills in order to create the right cloud environment.
Isn't that the reason to go, one driving compelling factor to go to the cloud in the first place is skill shortage, right? It's not my core competency, so let me take it to where it is.
But that's a type of skill. That's infrastructure management that you're referring to.
Right.
But in order to do cloud right, you need to have cloud architects. You need to have site reliability engineers. You need to treat infrastructure as code, and that's developers. And that's in short supply. Getting that right is incredibly hard. it's a rarefied skill set. So what people try to do is do the lift and shift, which is whatever I have in my physical data center, I'm going to replicate the same thing over there, then done. I don't have to think about it. But now what you've done is apply an old model to a new infrastructure, and you end up spending the 5x that you were talking about.
And I've at best case, exacerbated the problem. I haven't solved the
You
problem.
haven't solved the problem, exactly. So it's not the lack of security, it's lack of skills for a new domain.
Okay, so everybody, cheer up. We're gonna lift this conversation up. We're gonna talk about the good news and the opportunity. I'm going to go to audience questions, but first, I have one more question. Just sort of wrap up this phase of the Q&A and panel discussion. Here's kind of the next burning question. What do you do? Zero Trust. What do you do first? What do you do next? What's that one thing? Let's keep it short. Keep it. Make it different and unique. But if you had 5 minutes in front of someone that had a lot of money to solve a problem, and it's Zero Trust you're talking about, what do you do? What do you do first?
Can I bogart the conversation?
Yeah.
Because actually, Andy got it right. It's visualize what you have, understand where things are. That's step number one.
Wow. Can you disagree with him, please?
Yeah, I'm going to disagree. No, not at all. No. So I'm going to say, and I'll do it quickly, that I think that what cyber has failed on most miserably is ignoring every single lesson we've ever learned from physical security in the physical world. So take a really easy example. It doesn't matter who the president is or whether we like him or not, or her or not, but there is this person called the President of the United States. There's this organization called the Secret Service. There are two things they do insanely well. One, they do not let the person go somewhere without understanding the entire telemetry and environment that the person's going to be in. They understand every ingress, every egress. They have maps. They understand the building, the infrastructure. They spend a lot of time learning about the place, no matter whether there's a security incident or not. That's the visualization. But the second thing that we screw up in the cyber world all the time is we think that we can peanut butter the investment and secure everything evenly. In the physical world, we do the exact opposite. We say the stuff in the vault in the bank is by far the most valuable stuff. If they rob us, let them steal the paper clips sitting on the desk. We don't want to be robbed at all, but the paper clips are easy to replace. The stuff in the vault is hard. If there's one thing that we say to a customer, do it with whatever vendor you want, figure out your crown jewels, your most valuable assets, and go and overinvest in protecting those things first.
Okay, so we've got visualize and we've got crown jewels. Know your they're your core competency, right? If I'm
bank, it's your payments.
Right. If I'm a law firm, it's my
client database.
Deepak, what's that one thing?
Just another take on what Andrew mentioned. I think Zero first needs to be enforced on privileged users and their actions, administrators. So I think you're talking about all random devices here and so on, but privileged users, administrative users, they need to be under Zero Trust methodology. And it's not just Zero Trust; it also needs to be just-in-time trust.
That's fair.
Maybe growing out of the visualization is we've gotten used to have a perimeter firewall, and everybody understands if you get breached and you don't have a firewall, you may get fired. But applications have become complex, and we are completely fine running applications east-west with lateral movements without internal perimeters or east-west security or microsegmentation, whatever you want to call it. So I would say the pitch is you better understand the value that your application east-west is happening, is bringing to your organization, and all the breaches that can bring, because if you don't have an east-west security solution, your north-south firewall is as good as the hole that you have for port 80 or for SSL.
So I think that's 4 good, wise pieces of advice. I'll give you a 5th, not because anyone asked, but 5 is better than 4. So from my view of the world, it's decommission privileged Wi-Fi and legacy VPN. Find a way, again, it's back to that perimeter model. There's no good reason to let people into our organizations and perimeters the way we've always done it. Instead, expose an application and then use identity access management to understand who these people are. That's not the end-all, be-all, but that's certainly one thing. If you were going to do something now, think about privileged Wi-Fi, legacy VPN access. All right, so 5, I think, good things. Remember, one goal is how do you get this off the whiteboard and get it into action? What do you do? And I think those are great. That's great advice. Okay, so I've got a bunch of good questions from the audience, and 4 seem to have trended to the top here. So I'm going to take these a little bit out of order, and these are really compelling and questions I didn't think about. So 90% of the IoT, Internet of Thing devices have no security. We could probably agree 90% are insecure. And a large number of attacks originate from IoT devices. How do we address this problem in the context of zero trust? Is it the same way is it different, or is it just an extension of the same problem?
It's an extension of the same problem, but at the same time it's different because they are assets that you have into your hospitals, into your industrial floors that you may not even know that you have. So now you have to be able to discover them and profile them in a way that you can attach kind of a synthetic identity based on how they behave and then apply the right policies. So I would say it's not that different. It's just that, again, the tools that we have to use in order to establish identity and policy may be slightly different, but conceptually you want to understand who's who and who's doing what and be able to have some sort of enforcement.
It's just a scale problem. In other words, it is an extension of the same problem. It's the same sort of use case, but I think the difference is that if you have 100,000 servers, you may have 400,000 or maybe even 500,000 or 1 million devices that theoretically are floating around in the world that in some way, shape, or form interact with that ecosystem. And so it becomes a problem of scale. That's what we hear very often from customers is it's not that I expect that I'm going to know and understand and control every one of these things, but there's a lot of them out there, and I really need to have some way of being able to put a fence around them and understand what they are, even if it's not each individual one.
I'm not an expert on the topic, so I'm not going to comment. I do think it's a scale problem, but it's a complex and rich enough problem that I'm probably not qualified to comment on it.
Okay. Deepak, any thoughts there? Just the IoT thing has to be an emerging, interesting area for investors.
You know, we have made bets in IoT security in a company called Zingbox. I think IoT security, the problem is IoT is not a uniform thing. So IoT security cannot be uniform. It's like a bunch of different things together, right? So the problem of discovery and visibility is much, much harder in IoT. And today, security is going by, I need to be proactive in saying I have this asset, be it a data center asset or is it an IoT asset. And I think automatic visibility is like, this is a key thing. And then two is you need to differentiate the importance of the asset. And like, is it an MRI machine? Is it like a video camera? Is it like a doorbell or whatever that is? And I think, and that differentiation also needs to be automatic. We don't go and register our website on Google Search. Google Search just goes it automatically and assigns a page rank automatically. So I think we need to get that same concept into IT assets and IoT assets too.
So let's stay on the topic of emerging, like white-hot emerging technology trends, and talk about the intersection of zero trust and artificial intelligence and machine learning. What comes to mind? What are the benefits? What are the thoughts there? Are they complementary? Does AI make zero trust more of a reality, or is it the opposite?
I'm just glad you laughed when I did.
What is AI? I don't understand.
So I know what natural stupidity is. I don't know what artificial intelligence is. So AI is really pattern matching. And it's a way of discovering relationships. So if you have the right training set, and the right algorithms, you can get insights. But that's a very broad statement that I'm making. I mean, we have to understand what is the domain, what are the problems that we want to solve, what's a data set, and then go solve that with AI. AI is not a magic pill.
Yep. Okay.
I think in security, it's getting a lot of airplay, but if you actually dig under the covers, there's not a lot of reality to somebody being able to walk in and say, this is what my AI or my ML is doing, and this is the effect on the outcome yet. I think as there's better data sets, as the algorithms get better, there will be better outcomes. But if you really press people on if you use this ML or AI that you're claiming is built into your platform or your product, show me the differential in the outcome. Why am I safer? What is it finding that otherwise wouldn't be found? It's still a tenuous connection between those two. It will get better over time. The data sets will get bigger and the algorithms will get smarter, but it's still very early days.
You know what freaks me out the most is when companies claim that our ML is so good, we don't know what it's doing.
Yeah.
See, I have a startup idea. I think if we enforce zero trust on all the AI models that other startups and companies are peddling, and that's actually a good business.
There is a running joke that you don't go out and raise money nowadays without saying that I have ML and AI. You don't have to actually define what it is or how it works, but you definitely want to make sure it's part of your pitch deck.
All right, so let's go back to the perimeter idea a little bit here. I want to dig in on this a little bit, and I think the audience does too. I think we're probably 50-50 on whether the perimeter's dead or it's still needed or a perimeter firewall. But it seems increasingly that maybe the person is the perimeter, right? I'm fond of saying work is what we do, not where we go. And I can work independent of time and space. I need this and an application and a connection. And so maybe the person is the perimeter. So this is a little bit of a subtle question. What role do people play in zero trust? What's the intersection with people in zero trust?
I mean, maybe going back to identity, the question is, what is identity, right? And you are a human using a tablet that runs an operating system with a set of libraries, and you're exhibiting a behavior. So is your identity yourself or something else? And if you go to the notion even as how do we behave as humans, right? We have a government-issued ID and a passport and a work badge. So we have multiple identities, and those identities carry metadata about us that in certain environments may behave differently, right? So the notion of the human is always like, is it really you? When your tablet is misbehaving, is it really you? Or is an open source component or a commercial software that has been hacked and compromised? So that's why the thing is as the perimeter goes closer and closer to the user, because as you were going back with the VPN example, you don't want to have a tunnel to your enterprise that everybody can come in. So it would be better to understand this is Randy's tablet doing something misbehaving. But going back to what is identity and how do we add context to that identity to understand how the end user applies to the security.
Andrew?
So, this is where your bias starts to come in. I think that one of the challenges that we have is that there isn't enough money and there aren't enough days to sort of go around to protect everything. It's just sort of a fact of life. I think that's why in the physical world we sort of approach it the way that we do. The reality is that we don't have the same security at Boise Airport that we do at SFO because there's just more attack surface at SFO and there's more likelihood of something bad happening. And I think to try and imagine a world in which we somehow have figured out a security model that works on 250,000 employees at JP Morgan Chase and every one of the 8 devices that they carry, and somehow be able to maintain that posture in a highly dynamic, changing world, it just feels like the task sort of becomes overwhelming. And so you relook at it through the lens, and this is where I acknowledge my bias, and you sort of say, at the end of the day, if one or every single one of those 1.5 million devices got breached into right now, is it the stuff on the device, or is it what the device connects to in the data center that has the customer credit card records that really is the problem? And if we're going to overinvest in understanding and protecting something, shouldn't it be the end state of the attack, not the starting state? And I acknowledge it's a biased view because that's what we talk to our customers about for the most part, is protecting and helping them to understand these crown jewels. But there is just sort of an economic reality to the fact that we may not be able to protect every single device in every single user's hands and understand in real time all these things. But we certainly can understand the narrow scope of things that everybody's trying to get to. So it is, I don't know if it's controversial, but it is sort of a little bit of an antithetical view to the notion that we're going to figure all of this out and solve the whole problem of every person and every device they carry.
So I'll try to synthesize what Pere and Andrew said in a more general setting. By the notion of my birth and some overseas work that I did, I've lived in police states, and I know what the security theater looks like. And it turns out that if you live in police states, you're actually not as secure. U.S. is not a police state, but I feel a lot more secure here. And why is that? Because it comes down to an individual. And as Pere mentioned, it's really what the individual does and the context that they're doing it and the actions and the devices that they're using. If you understand these, then you can profile risk pretty easily while leaving the individual alone until they become a risk. That's not a police state. That's just looking at signatures and say, at this point, this individual is displaying risky behavior. Otherwise, leave them alone and let them be free and do whatever you want to do. So, yeah, coming back to the individual does matter, but it's how that individual is interacting with devices and how that device is interacting with the world that matters.
Got it. So I promised Fred I was going to leave him 5 minutes. 5 minutes. We have 10 left, so I have 5 minutes. Yeah. So.
Actually, I have a question for you.
Uh-oh.
We're all wearing jeans. What happened to you?
I didn't get the spiffy Silicon Valley memo to wear I do have the fancy jeans. I just probably should have worn them.
They don't have to be fancy.
I always bought Levi's, and then one day my wife marched me into Nordstrom, and I got a pair of overpriced
Levi's
jeans that they actually hemmed up. I've never had my jeans tailored before, so I left them at home. Next time, I thought about the black T-shirt and the cool jeans, and so next time.
That's how I mask my age too.
I much prefer the jeans, the stretchy jeans at my age. They're and they call them vanity size. All right, so final question, and this is for everybody on the panel, and whoever jumps in first, have at it, and we'll just go from there. Are we still talking about zero trust in 5 years? Is it reality? And if so, or if not, what does cybersecurity look like? What is it? I'm asking you to look into the future and be a little bit of a fortune teller. But are we still talking? Is it reality? Like we look back 5 years and say, I remember when that panel sat on the stage and they were talking about something that we're seeing now, or is this all just a bunch of nonsense and now we're talking about something else?
I think we'll be talking about something else.
Talking about something else.
And maybe the argument is because like these cycles of transformations and new concepts last 5 to 7 years max, and then you need a new cycle and a new set of marketing terms, otherwise we would be writing about the same thing. And my bet is that we may be doing the same things, having exactly the same problems, but it's going to be called something else.
But AI keeps coming back. It was hot in the 70s and hot in the 80s,
yes,
and
in the
it just keeps
50s,
coming back.
I think we're already talking about distributed trust.
Exactly. And identity is the new boundary, the new perimeter is identity.
I think something sticks when it becomes actionable. I mean, that's what it boils down to. So if zero trust ends up becoming something that is actionable, if there's a set of security controls that really large and sort of meaningful organizations get their hands around and they can implement it, it'll stick. Whether the term sticks or not, I mean, that's probably marketing, and I know that's way over my head, but if it is actionable, it will become real. If it turns out that it's this big sort of amorphous concept, and in reality, nobody can figure out what to do about it or how to implement it, it'll die sort of the quick death that it deserves if it can't become reality.
I think it depends on the hands of either a big company or a startup company to be the flag bearer of zero trust. You know, things don't become trends by themselves. Like some companies, the flag bearer of a trend, right? Social networking didn't become a trend. It became a trend because of Facebook. So social networking was a consequence of Facebook rather than the other way around. In the same way, like, you know, online gaming was a consequence of Zynga in some ways. And the first generation gaming was a consequence of Nintendo and other consoles. So the real question is, you know, which company, be it a startup or a big company, is going to be the flag bearer of zero trust. And of course, zero trust can mean different things for different people, but
This one.
we're looking forward to that. So I think if a company is going to build the first IPO-able company in the startup world that is going to say, we became big because of zero trust, and this is what zero trust is, and this is what customers should adopt, then we're probably going to be talking about everybody implementing zero trust. If not,
I think that's right.
you're going into distributed trust, undistributed trust, or
Just-in-time trust.
Yeah, fun thought. So I'll just, again, because no one asked me, my belief is, and I'm not so much of an optimist, I believe 2019, this year, and into next year, is truly the year for to see zero trust implementation, the real, tangible, substantive zero trust manifestation, whether it's in the context of what Aporeto and Illumio do, or Akamai, for example. I think that the key is not to overcomplicate it with fancy names. I think the principles are sound. I think the problems we're trying to solve are real and big, but I do think this is the year that we take some of this off the whiteboard and we start seeing it in action. And I don't think it's one solution. I think it's a combination of solutions that all hone back to the same principle, the same fundamentals that we all sort of started off and talked about. And so I have just a few closing comments. I did want to give a shout out to the audience member who asked, I think, the best question we won't answer, but it's, given the legacy and complexity, is winter coming? So that's an indication of, maybe that was the VLabs team having fun with me. That's a great question. I think it goes to show how complex and shapeless this conversation is, and how big the problem is. The good news is there's a lot of really smart people and a lot of really good, aggressive investors that are working to solve this problem. And again, I started off by saying if everybody's thinking the same, no one's thinking. And I think a lot of people are thinking differently, and there's a lot of good thought out there that together starts to solve this problem. So, gentlemen, thank you. This is great. We could have gone 3 hours with this, so thank you.